In a world drowning in data, open source intelligence is the difference between noise and insight. I'm Jake Creps, and this is the OSINT Podcast, unpacking the tools, tactics, and techniques that matter to the OSINT community. Whether you're tracking threats, analyzing platforms, or just trying to separate signal from noise, this is your go-to resource for all things open source intelligence. Let's get started. Hey everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the OSINT Podcast. My name is Jake Creps, and I'm your host. Thank you again for joining us if you listened to the first and second episodes of the podcast. But if you're new here, welcome. This is a companion podcast to the OSINT newsletter, and this is going to be following issue 79 of the OSINT newsletter and all of the content within it. Here is a quick summary of everything that we're going to cover in this episode. We're going to be talking about investigating botnets and a video that was published by Benjamin Strick on step-by-step case study for open source intelligence investigations. Then we're going to be looking at a study of the OSINT tradecraft at a high level from an academic perspective. And then we're going to be looking at OSINT for bad, not OSINT for good this time, and a couple different case studies on how open source intelligence can be used for malicious reasons. And then we're going to be moving over into the OSINT tools section, where we're going to be talking about the VSCO Spy browser extension that allows you to see a lot of very valuable metadata about posts that are on VSCO, sometimes even including coordinates, which is something that has been a bygone era for open source intelligence as of recently. Then we're going to be talking about CLI tools from Shodan and how now they offer a lot of different tools out of the box that OSINT tools previously provided, like FabUp, for example, that allows you to get a lot of rich intelligence from Shodan without having to use unmaintained tools on GitHub. Finally, we're going to be talking about SERP APIs and over-the-counter APIs, if you will, to take more creative approaches for open source intelligence. And in this case, we're going to be talking about TikTok and how these two different sources can be used to be able to create tools without needing to have a significant amount of research background like some more advanced practitioners have. Another announcement I wanted to make is that we are planning to expand the OSINT newsletter to include more than 2 issues per month. This is partially in response to a lot of people who have said that they need more beginner-friendly content, some people that are new investigators that aren't as advanced and can't just jump straight into some of the content that we're seeing on the newsletter in the past. So if that is you, if that sounds like you, then over the next quarter or so, you can expect to see more of this content, and there'll be more of that to come here pretty soon. So there's a lot of different methodologies that we want to talk through that are very basic, from Google Dorks to geolocation, to reverse image search, to all these different things that many practitioners are already familiar with. But if you're new, this could be something that could be helpful for you. If you haven't subscribed to the OSINT newsletter, go ahead and head on over to osintnewsletter.com. And this is episode 79, so you can do osintnewsletter.com/79. Go ahead and subscribe, and you'll be able to see some of that new content. And we're probably going to stick it somewhere in between the paid issues that we're seeing now, which are bi-weekly. So maybe every week we'll have some new content. Some of that will be beginner. If you missed the last newsletter and the last podcast, here's a quick overall view of what that was. We talked about search in a post-AI world and a lot of the content that you could find in OSINT newsletter issue 78. So you can head on over to the osintnewsletter.com/78. And you can read it there. Or if you prefer to listen, you can check out the podcast, episode 2. It's called Scraping Smarter, AI Agents, Tattoos, and Hidden Data. Now, with all that said, let's go ahead and get started in today's episode of the podcast. In typical fashion, we are going to start at the OSINT news section of the OSINT newsletter. The first thing that I post is how we found the people behind a bot network. This is a video, it's about 15 minutes long, that was posted by Benjamin Strick, and it walks through how a Jakarta-based firm, Inside ID, ran a 2019 operation on West Papua, showing how both online opinion can be manipulated, and more importantly, how Benjamin Strick and his team were able to use free tools to expose some of those disinformation networks. Some of the tools they used were Whois Lookup, reverse image search, and social network analysis. And so as I mentioned at the beginning part of this podcast, there's a lot of lack of beginner-friendly content that's in this newsletter, and we're working on getting a little bit more of that in here. This is one of these posts, one of these pieces of content that if you're a newer investigator, you should definitely check out. Benjamin Strick's YouTube channel is also a gold mine for open source intelligence techniques. If you don't follow him on social media and you don't follow his YouTube channel, you're definitely missing out. So go ahead and give that a look. Like I said, it's about 15 minutes long, so I won't go into a deep dive of what it is now, but essentially there is some land disputes, or I guess sovereignty disputes in West Papua, where there was a treaty that was signed that, essentially gave people in West Papua their independence, but there's a lot of strife in that area about the legitimacy of that. And this marketing firm was sort of running influence operations to change public opinion about that. And they left a lot of digital footprints and clues along the way, like they were hijacking hashtags that were relevant to the cause. They were creating a bunch of fake pages that were being used to spread mis and disinformation. Definitely something worth checking out, especially if you're looking at open source intelligence from an investigative journalist lens. The next thing on the list is the analytical hierarchy of open source intelligence. If you go back to the summary, I mentioned that there is going to be some academic sort of high-level overview of the open source intelligence process or industry. This is what I'm talking about. So if you're familiar for an intelligence practitioner, or if you're coming at it from another industry, there's something called the intelligence cycle. Essentially is like you define your intelligence requirements, you begin collecting data, then you process that data, you transform that data, you use that data that's now transformed to create an intelligence product. You disseminate that product, you give it to your stakeholders, they give you feedback, they use that to make decisions. You bring that all back into the cycle, and it's this perpetual loop of improvement, right? But it doesn't ever really talk about some of the pitfalls of that cycle. Like, for example, sometimes data collection, you can go down a rabbit hole forever. And when do you know when it's time to cut that off? Same thing with data transformation. Like, how much enrichment of the data do you actually need? How do you know that you've met the intelligence requirements? And how do you create these high confidence analysis that stakeholders can use to make decisions? Or how can you change the way that you're going about doing your intelligence collection dissemination process to make sure that you're actually improving and you're not making the same mistakes over and over and over? So this is kind of a deep dive from an analytical thinking perspective. And one of the things that I sort of paraphrased from the article was to realize the full potential of open source intelligence and shed light on possible future events, because they do talk about super forecasting in this. Before they unfold, practitioners must adopt methods to quantify judgment, embrace feedback, and hold themselves publicly accountable. On the note of super forecasting, there's a great book out there that's called Super Forecasting. Back when I worked at Microsoft, I actually went to a workshop with some of the authors, and it really talks about how you can make connections and you can do certain amounts of analysis to not necessarily predict future events, but you can sort of deduce or reduce rather the likely potential outcomes down to only maybe one or two or three things, which allows you to give you a higher confidence, saying, well, there's a 33% chance this is likely to happen because there's only 3 likely scenarios, for example. Some of these may be weighted differently, and it's kind of just a different analytical approach for how you can tackle some of these things. So I recommend checking out this article, maybe even picking up that book, because it definitely changed the way that I think about things, and it's definitely stuck with me throughout my career. The next thing on the list is malicious uses of OSINT by cyber criminals and hackers. So this is something that I found on LinkedIn. It's a very extensive article. I don't think we have enough time to talk about it in this podcast, but essentially what it does is it covers several of the TTPs, or tools, tactics, and techniques that can be used either ethically, by folks like us who are just OSINT investigators, or unethically to collect information at scale. So a lot of times you might see stuff on like breach forums or any of these dark web markets that are selling data at scale. A lot of times they're using OSINT techniques. They're collecting, they're scraping, they're enriching, they're doing all this stuff. But instead of using it for good use cases, they're selling that data to the highest bidder, which oftentimes they're using it for malicious use cases like account takeover, scams, phishing, things like that. And so it does talk about a couple different use cases, like the Sony Pictures attack in 2014, how OSINT was used for bad in that case. It talks about the US CENTCOM social media takeover that happened in 2015. Some of these are a little bit of a stretch to classify as OSINT because it's like, well, yeah, they grabbed some OSINT here, but they had all this like data that wasn't open source, that wasn't publicly available, that was stolen or hacked or whatever, and they combined the two of them together. But it does illustrate the power of OSINT and how it can be used as an augmentation to traditional intelligence sources. So things like that are publicly accessible, like imagery analysis, whether or not you want to put that into an IMINT category, or if you want to have that as an OSINT attaché as well, that's up to you. But OSINT is often used to augment some of these other sources, mostly because there's just so much open source information that's out there that you can use to sort of bolster some of the analysis that you're doing on some of these closed or publicly unavailable sources that you're using for some of your intelligence requirements and doing some of your intelligence analysis. So another quote that I pulled from here that I thought was interesting was, alarmingly, intelligence agencies estimate 80 to 90% of all actionable intelligence comes from open sources, showing how much sensitive data lies exposed. So that's huge. 80 to 90% of all actionable intelligence comes from open sources. So that comes back to the whole 10 to 20% comes from closed sources. These open sources actually help validate some of the stuff that you're seeing in closed sources, mostly because there's just not an abundance of that information in many cases. All right, let's move on to the OSINT tools section. So there are 3 different tools that I cover here. I guess there's 2 tools and then one that is sort of a collection of tools. But the first one that I thought I'd cover, I originally saw this in a LinkedIn comment somewhere. I think Forensic OSINT posted something on LinkedIn. VSCO Spy popped up, so I went and checked it out. It's a browser extension. It's freely available. You can install it in seconds. I put it on Google Chrome for me. And what it does is, as soon as you get to VSCO, which you do have to log in, you do have to create an account and you have to search for images. It creates a little icon in the top left, and it's just the VSCO spy icon. And when you click on it, it gives you a bunch of metadata about the image that was posted. Now, unlike other social media that scrubs all the EXIF data about the device or about the photo that has been posted on the site, VSCO leaves that information exposed. So a lot of times you can get the device that was used. So that was an iPhone 13, for example. You can get the coordinates of when this was or where it was taken, at least. So you'll be able to say, okay, well, I know that photo was taken here. It was taken by an iPhone 13, all these different types of things that are, oftentimes digital forensic type discoveries that you're now getting open source through VSCO. So definitely something worth checking out. Like I said, it's free to use. It's sometimes we had some difficulty having it show up in certain areas. So you do have to go to the search section. You do have to search by keyword, and then you will begin to see some of those icons appear on some of the photos. But if you're just finding something that I think when you're not logged in or something like that, you will have issues. You won't see the icon. So a little bit of nuance here, but definitely something worth checking out, especially if you find yourself often on that site. And for those who aren't familiar, it is a site that's often used by the younger generation to post images. It kind of reminds me of Flickr, but for Gen Z, if that helps, some of the older audience that are listening into the podcast of what this is. So definitely worth checking out. It's the first thing on the list for OSINT tools. The next thing on the list is Shodan-hash, and it's a command line tool. So there's a technical intelligence component here. And what it does is it allows you to get a lot more information about a favicon of what you're seeing on Shodan. So real quick, I just want to read it directly off because there's an entire API documentation about it. So Shodan-hash is a command line to calculate simple hashes of a website, favicon, local file, or text. And it can be used freely without a Shodan account. So that part's important. You don't need a Shodan account. You don't need to buy one of these lifetime deals that they do on Black Friday to get an API key and all stuff like that. It can be used freely without an account. And one of the great things about hashing a favicon is it allows you to search by that hash on Shodan and find other things that are connected. So there was a tool called FavUp. I don't know if it's still being maintained or not. But essentially, it would turn the favicon image into a hash, and then you could search for that hash, and you could find all the other websites that were using the same favicon. So it would allow you to say, okay, website A is associated to website B because the file hash or the favicon are identical. And then you can continue your investigation from there to validate that, to ensure that the same favicon wasn't used in two different locations, even though there may not be related. And this used to be something that was a little bit more difficult to do. You had to use this GitHub project, and it was a little bit more complicated, but now it's straight out of the box. I'm not sure if the tool allows you to directly search and find everything, but as soon as you have that hash, you can just drop that in to Shodan, and you can continue your searches from there. The reason why I wanted to bring this up is this is one of, 5 different command line tools. They have a GeoDNS one, a few other ones that are worth checking out. So if this is the type of tool set that you're comfortable with, that you're familiar with, that you use very often, go ahead and check it out, because I didn't know that Shodan was coming out with their own tools. And so this is really cool. I love to see when the vendors themselves are putting out good tools for the industry, rather than relying on people to use their API to build tools themselves. That's the second thing that was in the OSINT newsletter. So go ahead and check that out underneath OSINT tools. All right. The last one on the list is called Tick Spider, right? And so what I've been trying to do in this podcast and just in the newsletter in general is not just giving you tons of tools and different news, but also showing you examples of how creativity comes into the OSINT tool space, because it used to be a lot easier to make tools. It used to be a lot easier to bypass a lot of these security measures and things like that. It's getting harder and harder, so you have to rely on creativity. A couple episodes ago, I mentioned how you can use SoundCloud tracks, link those to YouTube channels, reverse the YouTube channels, things like that. This is one where you use a SERP API, which is essentially a search engine scraper. It'll scrape Google, and it'll allow you to use Google via API rather than having to do web scraping, which is heavily restricted. And you can use some of those Google dorks that you've created, and you can use the SERP API to sort of automate that. But then there's an additional API marketplace called Apify that has a ton of different sources and methods that you can implement for very cheap, very inexpensive. So instead of being hey, I'm going to reverse engineer TikTok, I'm going to go under the hood, you're going to do stuff like what I do, where you're looking for APIs that are exposed, you're looking for information that's not posted on the user interface, but is under the hood. You're going to try to query those APIs to be able to pull data out, enrich that, transform it, etc. Instead of having to figure all that out, you can just choose an API that does some of that on Apify, combine it with the SERP API, and be able to manipulate this in a way to create your own custom tools. And so this is definitely an advanced use case for people who are building tools or people who work at companies where you're building solutions. But it's definitely something worth considering, is if the search engine on the site is restricted, if the search engine doesn't have a ton of filters that allows you to say, okay, I want this, but not that. I want to see it between this time frame and this time frame instead of just all of the search results. I don't want to see irrelevancy. I don't want to see anything like that. You can use the SERP API. And then once you get that data back, you can funnel that into another API that allows you to transform the data. So some of these APIs on Apify are $10 a month. So definitely something worth checking out if it's going to help fulfill some of your intelligence requirements. All right. That's it for the free version of the OSINT newsletter and the subsequent podcast. There is something that I want to talk about in the paid section. I'll just give you a high-level overview of it. And something that I've been working on for a little bit, which is collecting data at scale using proxies. Okay. Now, the first thing you think of when you think of using proxies typically is violating the terms of service of some website. Now, it can kind of get this weird legal gray area where if it's not behind a paywall or not behind a login screen, is it publicly available? Is it the same as taking a photo out in public, for example? That's not really what I want to talk about here. What I want to talk about is hey, you have a process where you go to a website every single day. You click and you have 700 tabs. I know those of you out there who have your tabs, you have so many tabs open that they're so small you don't even know what they are anymore. And you have to go through every single tab and pull data from it every single day. So people like vulnerability researchers, they're doing that all the time. People who are going to government websites and they're pulling data from there, for example. These are things that are very, very tedious. And what I'm proposing in this article, in the paid section of the newsletter, is how you can use proxies to augment your existing search capabilities and also increase your OPSEC by not bringing that information back to your connected device through your IP address. Even if you're using a VPN, you could still have things like your user agent being captured, and patterns can be detected from that as well. So what I talk about in this is, hey, you can use proxies. You can use them to collect data more quickly. You shouldn't use them for things like DDoS attacks, obviously. You shouldn't use them for scraping tons of data and then selling that data when you're violating terms of service, for example. But you should consider using them to make yourself more efficient. And this is especially when you're not using it for a service that you're asking money for. Let's say you're doing journalistic efforts, you're doing academic efforts, you're within an organization and you're protecting sensitive assets or people, and you're just looking to collect information faster. You're still collecting the information. You're still making the same number of requests to the website that you're going to. It just takes forever, and it takes your whole day to pull all the information out. And you probably got a bunch of duct tape tools together to figure out how to get all the information out. This article is talking about automating that process, collecting it all in a minute or 2 minutes instead of taking, all day to get the information. And so I talk about what proxies are, how you can use them, the difference between free proxies, because there's a lot of free proxies that are offered on the internet. You see them on sites like GeoNode. You see them on sites like GitHub, for example. They have their limitations, but I do talk about the use cases that you can start to implement some of these free proxies in. I talk about how you can use LLMs. You can use VS Code. You can use Copilot. You can use things like that to automatically apply these proxies to some of your projects. I talk a little bit about user agents and how you can rotate different user agents to obscure some of your traffic and some of the requests that you're making. Then I talk about paid proxies and how I use some of these services for some of the projects that I'm working on to be able to, let's say, pull 500 pages a day, collect the information that I want from them, and then be able to move on with my day. I have all the data collected. I have maybe a light layer of analysis that I apply to it, and then I can just take that information and make decisions with it, rather than spending all day collecting and then, being after hours or working through lunch to try to answer some of these questions with the analysis that I have to do. So I talk about 3 different sources that you can get proxies for as low as $4 a month if your project's really small. And then I go through a real world example and I talk about GitHub in this case. I talk about the rate limit restrictions that GitHub has. I talk about how you can do an authorized request using their API and how you can use an unauthorized request, the different rate limit restrictions there. I also talk about how you can implement proxies to be able to get more information from there if you need to do more than 5,000 requests per hour, for example. Or if you want to stay unauthenticated and you don't want anything traced back to your device, you only get 60 requests per hour. But what happens when you need to make 5,000 requests per hour unauthenticated? You don't want all this traced back to you, for example. So I give that as a real world example of how you can implement proxies. You can get that into LLMs. You can create scripts to be able to pull that information for you. And you can do it all without exposing your identity, maintaining your OPSEC along the way. I go through step by step of how you can collect that and where you can find some of those requests online. And so it's definitely something worth checking out. Again, it's very technical content. It's very advanced use case for a lot of people that are already, familiar with the whole intelligence cycle, who are been creating intelligence reports for years. But the biggest problems that they have now is collection and analysis and not necessarily dissemination and feedback. This is going to be the paid post for you. So definitely something worth checking out. I really like how this one turned out. It is kind of a beast of a post. I think I ended up clocking at 2,700, almost 2,800 words. So there's a lot of good content here for you to check out. So that's it for this episode of the OSINT Podcast. Thank you for those who have read the newsletter for a while. I appreciate that a lot of you have subscribed. We're just about 26,000 subscribers now, which is huge. I remember when I first started this, I moved over to Substack. I had 4,000 subscribers. So the growth has been amazing, and the number of people who've stuck with the publication has been great. And also thanks to all the people that have done a paid subscription of the newsletter and the podcast. It definitely helps with getting a little bit more resources, like some of the stuff we're going to see for some of the free content coming out for beginners. So once again, I just want to finish with to make sure that you subscribe to the podcast, leave a review if you enjoyed this episode. Also, give me feedback if there's something that's missing. Is the podcast too short? Is the podcast too long? Am I going too surface level on things? Should I deep dive into things more? let me know. You can reach out on Substack. You can reach out on any of the social media platforms, or you can email directly jake@osint.news. Thanks again for listening.